Welcome, everybody, to session 32 of Classic Metal Class. And our topic today is going to be counterfactuals, or what ifs that could have changed heavy metal history. I'm Greg Sadler. My co host here is Scott Tarulli. And we've got Mark here, and we may have a few other people popping in, some regulars from time to time. So we're going to have a discussion about what could have happened, what could have been the case. And this came out of, you could say, a lot of BSing around that Scott and I and Mark have done over the years, but I think a lot of people indulge in, and it could be just like hippies sitting around getting high and saying, "Hey, man, what if Led Zeppelin hadn't broken up?" or something like that, and not really thinking it out. But we want to think it through a bit. What would have been the case at critical juncture points if, instead of going this way, the band or performer or whatever had gone this way instead? Would it have made a difference in the world as far as this genre that we call heavy metal? So one of the cases that we're going to look at, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, what if Brian Robertson, who was from Thin Lizzy, had been a good fit for Motorhead from 1982 onward, and instead of making one really, really good album that didn't get a lot of traction at the time, and then going on tour with them in a way that wound up being somewhat disastrous, what if he actually had worked out and had produced another 3 or 4 albums with them? Would Motorhead look different now because of that? Or would it all still more or less be the same? So Scott and I decided to devote a session to thinking through some of these what ifs. And obviously there's like thousands of these that we could bring up, but some of them I think are more important, more salient than others. You could say, like, well, what if Eddie Van Halen had broken a string when they were playing at the Whiskey a Go Go? For all I know, he did. That first gig that they did, probably he would have just, fixed the string and it wouldn't have been a big deal, right? Or what if Chris Holmes had stuck around in Wasp slightly longer, for one more tour date? Well, I don't know that would make that much difference. So we're gonna go into these, but I think that before we do that, we want to kind of clarify what we're talking about in two different ways, thinking about the scope of what we're discussing, and then a little bit of philosophy, thinking about what it means to say what if, right? So, and then Scott, before we get started, I mean, why did you want to do this particular topic? Did these what ifs ever come up for you? I mean, you're actually a practicing musician. Are there some what ifs in your career that you think to yourself, oh man, what if I had gone this way instead of this way, either positive or negative?
Well, to answer your last question, that happens all the time. What if I had used this bass player on my first album?
Mm.
You know, and a lot of it comes down to the question really is, well, when I was 24, what if I had the self-confidence to do this, which I avoided? But, it does happen with band members too. It's like, did I hold on to playing guitarist in this gig for so long? What if I had chosen to jump to this other band, which I had the opportunity to? So the topic is kind of cool. I mean, I think the original one you and I discussed without even thinking about it is always the Paul Di'Anno days versus, the Bruce Dickinson days.
Yeah.
And I really have a deep love for both of them, but I'm always thinking, because would Steve Harris have just kicked him out eventually because he couldn't produce what was in it? Because Steve Harris was always moving forward.
Yeah.
But it just happens to be, but like, what I would like to hear the next 2 albums Paul Di'Anno did before he would, it's kind of like we always ask, what if Hendrix didn't die? What would he have done during the 80s?
Yeah.
So I find myself asking these questions that it's kind of like the movie Sliding Doors. You don't really know the answer, but maybe you can make would that be an inductive argument? Like, you can take a bunch of ideas and say, well, this possibly could have happened.
Yeah. I mean, strictly speaking, what we're doing is more what we call abductive than inductive, in part because inductive, we have to have a lot of cases and experience that we're generalizing from. And if we're dealing with just a couple really interesting cases, and then we're trying to infer what would have been the case, that's a bit trickier. And some people would say, from a very rigorous perspective, oh, we can't know anything about those sorts of things. Too many factors. But I don't know. I think that there's something to be said about expertise, like what you've got. When we talk about technical things, what if this technical innovation had been introduced in a mass way 5 years earlier, or people had
Right.
never figured this out, right? Those sorts of things, you could say a lot more about that than I can competently. I mean, I can say stuff about it. I can like bullshit and pull things out of the air, right? I don't even know what some of the terminology might mean that you might use.
Right. I would have
and that-
more of I could fill in more of the variables.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Because like we had talked about in past discussions, like it or not, technology and production trends do play a role. Like, we always talk about Somewhere in Time being such a departure.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And but sometimes it's the band experimenting. So I always have to be careful with saying, oh, they really blew it when they did this. But another way to look at it is they tried something, it didn't do well, but maybe they really loved it. It kind of flopped, like the albums that flop. We always assume that it's something the band wished they never did, but a lot of times it's something that they wish did well because they really enjoyed it.
I think two prime examples of that would be, and having to do with production, would be Judas Priest's first album, Rockarola, which they were not happy with the production on. But I think it's a great album, and I really enjoy listening to still. And then Black Sabbath's Born Again, which, is kind of legendary for not a great production. There's been like a remastered version of it that came out, but it's still just a monster massive album that I think is, quite good, although a lot of people at the time panned it. So
I seem to be one of those people that really likes the panned albums. So, speaking of your example with Motorhead,
yeah,
I love that album, and I think the guitar on it's exceptional.
Yeah,
right from the Thin Lizzy alum, a Thin Lizzy alum, and so their next album I think was like 84, 85, or what was it, or
86, Orgasmatron.
Orgasmatron. Now, forgive me, I who played guitar on that one?
Two guitars. It was Wurzel and Phil Campbell, and Wurzel would stay with them for a few more albums, and then they would go back to being a three-piece again.
Yeah, I thought it was that album is a great. I actually went back and listened to that album. It's been a while. It doesn't do it for me like the 82 album. Like, that album is a great record.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting that you chose that one, because my answer to that would be in the end, it's still Lemmy, right? We talk about, we talk about, well, it would have been a big deal if, Lemmy left and then somebody filled in for Lemmy.
Yeah, so this is a good segue to talking about like determinative factors, right? Lemmy and Motorhead, Steve Harris and Iron Maiden. With some bands, it's not, Blackie Lawless for Wasp, but some bands, it's not quite so easy to identify like the one person who is really setting the stage. Or if you can, it might not be one of the people in the band. Like with Def Leppard, Pyromania, and then the radical difference in sound on Hysteria, that's driven by Mutt Lange, who's not a member of the band, but is their guru, their producer, their Sven Gulli behind the scenes, right? So, but let's clarify the scope of what we're
Okay.
talking about here. So, when we talk about heavy metal, right, it's a big, messy genre. We've looked at the issue of trying to define it before and said, well, you can't really define it. It's this complex musical movement that now we've got more than 50 years of, and there's all these different developments that are driving it, and it involves just a massive thousands and thousands of individuals who themselves are motivated by all sorts of desires. They imitate each other, they rival each other, they conceive of possibilities, they go in this direction, then go in this direction, and decisions that are made about really important determinative matters are usually not like, hey, let's flip a coin, man, or we just get up one morning and do something. Now there are a few things like that. Apparently Toni Iommi and Ian Gillan, and I think maybe Geezer Butler joined them. They went out and got totally drunk, and Ian Gillan found out the next day that he was now in Black Sabbath. So sometimes things like that happen, right? But that's not the way things usually go. And so there's usually a lot of like stuff happening in the background, and we can ask ourselves all sorts of interesting, really, really big picture questions that we're gonna kind of avoid because they're a bit too big. Like, well, what if the music scene had not evolved in ways that were conducive to the formation of this new genre? And some of those things could be technical. Like, what if the technology for amps had evolved much more slowly? Could you have had that sound that you needed? Or what if people didn't value guitar virtuosity as they began to in the 1960s? Or here's another one. What if there was, on the one hand, more economic prosperity in the 1970s and 80s, so that the young men, primarily young men, some women who were playing heavy metal actually had really remunerative jobs, and at best could be like the guy in that Dire Straits song who plays on Saturday nights, right, and can't make a go of it? Or what if that era had huge wars or famines or economic collapse rather than just stagflation, and it wasn't possible to have a record industry or anything like that? Now that's too big for us to really worry about, I think. And we also, it's tough to say with technological changes. I think those are really big picture too. Like, what if Les Paul had never lived, right? It's not as if you couldn't have had guitars, but and he wasn't a guy who liked heavy metal, but um, he certainly made a big impact.
Well, he was most famous for inventing multi-tracking.
Okay.
So if you ever heard his version of How High the Moon with Mary Ford, that was never done. It was her vocals stacked. And so if anybody that's watching this, if you haven't heard Les Paul and Mary Ford's version of How High the Moon, he had figured out a way to multi-track, so there was like 4 or 5 of her voices.
Yeah.
And a couple of his guitars, and he did some studio tricks that go that you listen to it and it's heavenly sounding, but it's impossible. How do you have that many? So he really, there were electric guitars. The Les Paul became because Fender had started the electric guitars, but Les Paul started the Les Paul, the whole Gibson range.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have that, that became such an iconic guitar on the guitar side. Classic rock of the 70s, everybody had a Les Paul.
Yeah. The multi-tracking thing is kind of important. If you think about like a 4-piece band like Black Sabbath, where you have one guitarist, a singer who basically only sings and maybe once in a while plays the harmonica, a bassist and a drummer, or Motorhead for that matter, where it's even more pared down. You've got a bassist who's kind of an unconventional bassist, who's also the vocalist, drummer, and one guitarist. Like, Motorhead songs and Black Sabbath songs, there's multi-tracking going on for the guitar parts there. That's why sometimes you have to have an additional person in the background playing on stage, or you just have a, you know, when the guitar is soloing over the bass, rather
Yeah,
than,
which I prefer. Like the what's the Doc and Live album that sounds like it was recorded in a garbage can, but we love it so much. Beast from the East.
Yeah.
And I love it because it's so raw. So when George Lynch takes off on his solos, it's just the drums and bass, and it sounds huge the way he plays, and it's just all the space for it. So I personally, I don't need to hear it like the album. I want to be part of the live moment, which sometimes means there's instruments missing.
Yeah.
With the arrangement. But that's a really good point about that, because I always think that part's worth talking about anyways, you know. But in the studio, like take the band Boston. That first record, you know, there was a lot of multi-track. I mean, the vocals, the guitars, it was what we call a perfect album, or at least we used to call a perfect album. We have a different definition of perfect this day and age, but you and I have a different definition of perfect than people these days that line everything up, quantize it, auto-tune it, you know, and then it's lost its soul in our opinion.
Auto-tune's a funny thing. I mean, when you can tell that it's being used, it's sort of like knowing somebody's using ChatGPT to write you a personal note, you know. It doesn't work, right? So
no, I've done records, and I won't mention names, but I've done records with singers. They're absolutely fantastic, but the producer insists on auto-tuning their voice,
really,
and quantizing, which means as part of singing is somebody's phrasing, the way that how long they hold a note, or they might come in a little later to give some dramatic. What they do is they line it up to a grid, and then you listen to it back and you say, this person has no character. This singer's lost their character and their soul, and it sounds like everything else on the radio, because a lot of producers are like, it has to sound like the radio or it's not valid, which might come up in our production, you know, talkings of today. Although I don't think metal was so much a casualty of it as much.
You know, I can think of one case, but this was done analog and not digitally. And I remember this from Bruce Dickinson's autobiography. He was talking about his time before Iron Maiden when he was with Samson. And there was a very famous drummer who, by the way, had been in Iron Maiden for a short time, called Thunderstick. And his identity was secret. He wore a gimp mask. You actually see him on the Samson Head On album cover. And apparently he was a great drummer in many respects, but he didn't keep proper time when he was playing. And somehow it worked with the band, but when they were doing studio production, they had to go in and like fix the drum track somehow. And you think about like how painstaking that must have been to, like, you know, tiny little tweaks here and there, right? Because he's not like 100% off. He's just like slightly off. So some measures are longer than they should be, and some are shorter than they should be, because he's the one who's keeping the time, you know. And you think about the work that must have involved. And, you know, you'd say to yourself, well, why don't you just get rid of him? Well, he was an integral part of the band, you know. And I guess in concert it worked, you know.
Live you can get away with it more, but you know, the answer to that is usually, and you know, a lot of albums you and I own, the actual players aren't on the album. Like the
class, it could be studio musicians, you mean?
Yeah, so like, you know, like Warrant, they were good guitar players, but they weren't good at coming up with good parts or playing it right the first time. So to save money, the producer would call on, I mean, it's no secret, I could say it, you know, like for example, Reb Beach was the guitarist on one of the he replaced JJ French.
Oh, on Twisted Sister.
I forget which Twisted Sister album.
Interesting.
And that's not a secret. You know, my friend Dave Kelber was with me. We were talking to Reb, and he said, so, you know, you were on this album. And Reb looked at him and goes, how did you know that? And we're like, we hate to tell you, Reb, but everybody knows that now. And so he was talking about JJ French, like kind of strutting around the studio, like picking up a guitar and showing off and stuff. Like it was kind of a weird thing, but Reb went in there and played the album like first take, but he's not in the liner notes, and he didn't play like Reb. He played like JJ French.
Yeah, it's like being a ghostwriter in a lot of respects, you know?
Yeah, it's true, and I'm wondering why they didn't just have a session drummer that they pay, and then you do a non-disclosure, and their name's not on the, because as time goes on, we start to, like, Warrant was a big band that happened. Actually, Steve Lukather was quoted as saying, with a lot of those albums, if it wasn't me or that was on the album, I'll tell you who it was. You know, and it's like Robin Ford on Creatures of the Night. Like that does not sound like Robin Ford at all, but it was him, because isn't that the one that either, I think Ace had a motorcycle accident?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I didn't mean to go on a tangent, but like
that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we look at the what ifs, let's talk a little philosophy stuff. So we are doing counterfactual thinking all the time, and we often don't call it that or realize it, but we're doing it constantly just by being human beings, and all the time that we're doing that, we're actually touching on some pretty deep metaphysical matters. And so philosophers have been looking at this stuff for a couple millennia, and I would say it's not just philosophers, but historians, you know, they think about this a lot, and so do certain fiction writers, especially in science fiction or speculative fiction. They think about models of time and stuff like that. So when we say something like, what if X were the case instead of Y, what are we actually doing? There's a bunch of different assumptions or commitments we're making. One of them is we're saying X was not the case. So we're putting forth something as a possibility that wasn't realized, at least in the timeline that we're in. And we're assuming that it's possible for X to have been the case, because it doesn't make any sense to say, well, what if, you know, Blue Oyster Cult had, instead of, you know, talking about Godzilla, they had a song called Mothra. Okay, that's a possibility, a really weird and distant possibility. But, you know, what if Godzilla had just been John Cage's, how long does that go on? Like 3 minutes and something?
44 seconds, yeah.
So that's probably not a possibility, right? Just a dead air or something like that. So we do have to talk about what is actually possible. And what we're really interested in asking about, when we say what if, we're leaving it open, but we're actually in the background saying, what would the consequences be? So if X had been the case, what would the future relative to X, which might be our past at this point, what would the consequences have been? And we're also, if we're being thoughtful, we're interested in what other factors would have been needed to be the case for X to be real and why not to be real. So take the Blue Oyster Cult thing that I just made up right now. If they, instead of Godzilla, they'd made a song about Mothra, you'd have to say, okay, well, you know, they would have had to have been talking about Godzilla movies, because that's where Mothra shows up. And somehow they would have decided, instead of for Godzilla, Mothra, because they liked moths better, or they thought they could make a better song out of it. You got to have a bunch of other factors. And this is what's going to separate us from the stoners sitting around saying, oh man, what if this had happened instead of that had happened? Well, we got to figure out these other factors, right?
I want to add one to that, because that's a good one. What if it was the same lyrics, but not such an epic riff?
Oh, yeah.
You know, because that's, what if it was just like, what if they made it more like a blues form, like Led Zeppelin's Rock and Roll with the Godzilla lyrics? Would anybody care? You know, and you know, little cool things like that little bass break. You always wait for that bo da bo.
You know, there have been these things that I've seen on YouTube coming out recently, and I think also as Facebook videos, and I think that they suck. And it'll be stuff like, what if, you know, what if Black Sabbath's album Black Sabbath had been done by guys back in the early 60s? And so they have the lyrics, right? But it's a very different kind of music, and it doesn't work at all. It doesn't.
You know what?
It
They're using AI for that.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, and it's boring as hell. And you're like, this. Okay, I see what you tried to do, but this didn't actually work. And they're doing a lot of these days, and they make them look like they're wearing like, old fashioned band stuff with the jacket and tie and all of that. You seen those things?
I've seen some of them, and it's just why? I mean, somebody's bored.
Yeah.
There's something in like you're saying, they're not going through the thought process of it. Well, they're just feeding it into AI, which doesn't really know anything except what the person knows.
And that might be why it ends up sounding just like early 1960s soft rock, essentially,
Well, that's what it is. Yeah, it's
yeah.
like, yeah, the information you feed into AI is what comes out, not AI's just do. Yeah, don't get me started.
Well, so let's finish up this philosophy part. So we have a technical name for what ifs in philosophy. We usually use the word counterfactual, or if we want to be a little bit fancier, counterfactual conditionals. And there's two parts to that. So one is counterfactual. If you're saying something is counterfactual, you're saying it is not the case. So it's not real, but it could have been real, right? And then the conditional part is the if. We're saying, given that X, was or is or will be the case, what would actually follow from it? What would the end part of that? And like I said, we're doing this all the time in our lives, sometimes with regrets, sometimes with, oh man, I'm so glad I made it through that situation. What if something worse had happened? What if I'd gotten in the market earlier or later? I could say, for example, if that string had not snapped while I was playing that song, I wouldn't have had to pause to replace it while finishing that song. And that's a kind of a trivial thing, but we could think about more momentous things. Like I used to play bass guitar and I was, decent at it. I probably never would have been like Steve Harris good or anything like that, but I probably could have been Nikki Sixx good, to use a phrase that one of my friends, Blitch, has used of his own bass playing, right?
Well,
And
you would have been Greg Sadler good, because you would have sounded like you.
Yeah, exactly.
You would have had your sound. You would have had your approach from your influences. I just want to stick that in there because it's important to know nobody could be Steve Harris, even the greatest.
Well, and what I would have had to have done is keep practicing like you did, doing stuff 6-8 hours a day, and I didn't do that, and I allowed my nascent talents to languish, and ended up passing my bass on to my kid, who also doesn't practice the way that she ought to. Now what we're doing there is we're talking about counterfactuals, right? Well, if I had done this, which I didn't do, what would have been the case? And some of this is very speculative. The music business is very tough. We might have made it in, we might not have made it in, who knows, right? But we're using this what if, or another word that we use in philosophy, if only, and we're saying that things would have turned out differently. And the more information that we have and the better information that we possess and the more we can link it up, the better predictions that we can make. So to take one of the examples that we're going to look at, hopefully, what if the tour bus hadn't crashed and Cliff Burton hadn't died in 1986? What would Metallica sound like today? Well, that's tough to say, but I think we can say a lot more about what and Justice for All might have sounded like, and whether they would have made the Black Album or not. Now, what would they be sounding like in 2010? I think there's too many different factors there for us to be able to predict. But, if we know our music history and we understand the mindset, the style, the interactions with these people, I think that we can actually make some decent predictions. And, some of them may actually be, well, nothing would have changed you know? And actually on the first one that we're going to look at, which I think is a really big one, I actually think not much would have changed myself. What were you going to say, Scott?
I was going to say the other factors I would throw into the Cliff Burton piece is one device I would use is look at the surviving members and what happened with them. So
yeah,
I'm a fan of the first few Metallica albums. And the Black Album, we have to assume that the bass player played a role in the Black Album, or if Cliff Burton would have gone along with that. If, you know, the sound definitely would have been different. Cliff had his own sound. And, you know, it's to the point where it was sorely missed when it was gone, at least to my ears.
Yeah. But he also had a massive role in the band. I mean, to back it up, like to the earlier album, there is no way that the bass would have been missing in And Justice for All if he had been around. Jason Newsted, they could kind of roll over on him because he's the new guy, you know?
That's a good point. Yeah. And I think I'm pretty sure back then they were all kind of the decision makers because they were they stuck together and like, you know, maybe that's why I like the early records so much. And, you know, they lost me at the Black Album, but that could have been a producer thing. Saying, you know, it could have been, you know, you need to make some hits and you need to make us some money right now.
Yeah.
But I guess it would decide if they wanted to remain kind of an underground metal band or if they wanted to, you know, I wonder if he would have had a say in the direction of the band. No, we don't need to sell 20,000 tickets. I want to play the clubs, or I want to.
Well, by that time they were already filling arenas. They'd gone from, so so actually, let me back it up. In 1988, Monsters of Rock in America, Metallica is the second band in the lineup. There's Kingdom Come, Metallica, Doc and Scorpions, and Van Halen. And I actually saw them on the first concert of that tour. It started here in Wisconsin at Alpine Valley. And Metallica just like basically, I mean, Kingdom Come, everyone was like, get out of here, get off the stage. We want to see some real metal, you know? And then Metallica came on and they were better than Doc or the Scorpions or Van Halen. And by the end of that tour, people were buying tickets to go see Metallica rather than to see these other bands. So it just kind of shows you, you know, they were really taking off. And that was with Jason Newsted.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Later. But the songs had been written, you know, all the stuff had come out that Cliff Burton had a massive role in. But let's talk. We'll come back to the Cliff Burton thing. So, you know, heavy metal is in some people's stories about it. It originated, you know, mainly with Black Sabbath, and specifically because of Toni Iommi having an accident the last day of his work that cut off his fingertips and made him for a little while say, I'm not going to play guitar anymore. And he actually talked about a couple different possibilities. One of the possibilities was to switch from left-handed to right-handed. And, you know, he didn't do that. But he said in an interview, I knew what I know now. I probably, if I knew what I know now, I probably would have switched. It would have been the rational thing to do, but he didn't want to do that. So, you know, there's this story. His friend gave him albums of this Django Reinhardt and said, hey, that guy is playing with an injured hand. And so Iommi makes some plastic fingertips for himself and develops a new way of playing. Now it's his fretting hand. So that's what's going on. And here's what he said. Some people believe the accident invented heavy metal. It helped me invent a new kind of music. I play a new sound and a different style of playing and a different sort of music. It does affect your playing style. You can't feel the strings with, you know, plastic stuff. And there's certain chords I can't play. So the idea there is he would be doing bar chords and playing in a certain way, less soloing, more chords, precisely because of the accident. And the question we have to ask is, are people overplaying this incident? Are we saying that Iommi would have never played like he did if he didn't have that accident and that path of recovery? And I want to say no, because the fact that other people at that time were also playing in similar ways kind of shows you that it's not just Black Sabbath, it's not just Toni Iommi. Maybe it like brought it up a notch or something. In 1971, he starts detuning because that makes it a little bit easier for him to work with the strings. But that's 1971. That's not Black Sabbath, and that's not Paranoid.
Right.
So, I'm a little bit skeptical of this one. The key elements of Iommi's stuff are blues based guitar solos, minor key riffing. He's got a certain sound, high gain, heavy distortion, power chords. Would that have been different if he hadn't have had the accident? I can't see how plastic fingertips lead to changing the way your amp is configured. So, I mean, what do you think about this, Scott? Does this?
Well, power chords were common in all, like in Deep Purple.
Yeah.
Like this is, I think it influenced the way he approached it, but I don't think it made the music heavier. So
Okay.
I think like when we say his solos, he might have been a different kind of technical player.
Yeah.
But Black Sabbath would have still been heavier. I mean, in writing the songs, I don't think all of the writing came down to his technical ability to play faster, or he's not going to be playing. I don't know anybody that was
or more precise.
When I was younger, I used to think he was sloppy, but I listen to him now. It's just like the Paranoid solo or any of those solos. They're cool. They're in time. They sound great. They're just not exceptionally difficult, but they're creative. Then when you go to Blackmore, it's definitely more technical. So I guess what would happen, like, Sabbath was, Iommi was a riffmeister. I mean, he came up with these great riffs, most iconic riffs, but I don't think it would have made this. I mean, Ozzy had a hand in writing this stuff. I don't think he was the one that created. He was an important member in Sabbath, yes, but I can't see. It's not like everybody else was playing these crazy chords, and he invented power chords because he was. You know what I mean? So he didn't really. Nothing was invented from it. But maybe, it's like all of us, some people have the ability to play extremely fast and speed pick, and other people either don't feel like working on it or don't have that kind of, you have that kind of like ability right off the bat. So everybody kind of does play to what they have. And if he's doing that, I don't know if I would say, I don't know if I would say he single-handedly invented heavy metal because of his accident.
Yeah, I think that's going way too far. There's other bands at the time who are rising. We talk about Deep Purple, people bring up Led Zeppelin, but I'd say that UFO is already doing heavy metal stuff. Uriah Heep arguably as well. But here's an interesting thing to think about. So if you didn't have the recovery time that was required from having had the accident, maybe Paranoid would have come out months earlier. Would that have made an important difference? Like maybe it wouldn't have been received as well, or maybe it would have had a bigger impact. Or not Paranoid, but rather Black Sabbath, the first album.
I mean, it's iconic to this day. So as far as well received, I mean, anything before 1964 would have been crazy. I always say that's the start. The Beatles, February 9th, 1964, Ed Sullivan.
Yeah.
And we always talk about how quickly things escalated just like 6 years after that, where you have Led Zeppelin's first album, which is pretty heavy. You have you know, you have Sabbath, you have Purple, you have all these bands coming out that it's quite impressive. So I don't know. I don't think that there's a timing thing. I think it became part of who he was and how he played. I would go that far.
Okay. Yeah.
But here's the question, though. If they put out the first 3 albums, then he lost his fingers.
Oh.
Then you would hear a total shift into a new direction where we only heard the direction that was made for him, because before that took off, he had to deal with it.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's not the only member in the band. You know, he's not.
Yeah, I mean, Butler, I would argue, is just as important. You know,
Geezer Butler, of course, and the bass being heavy, the heavy part of that too.
Yeah. Well, and he was very involved in the songwriting too. You know,
exactly.
Well, let's talk about the one that you brought up a little bit earlier. Then, what if Paul Di'Anno had not been fired from Iron Maiden? And this is a really interesting case because, okay, so with Sabbath, the 2 members that drive it the most are Geezer Butler and Toni Iommi. With Iron Maiden, that is Steve Harris's band. And once Rob Smallwood joins, I mean, the guys from Judas Priest actually said that we wish we had somebody like Rob Smallwood. We probably would have had greater success, because working together with Steve Harris, they just, ran the show. And there's a lot of lineup changes before Paul Di'Anno actually comes on, not just at singer, but at drummer, guitarists, until 1978, they don't have a stable configuration. Mm-hmm. And Steve Harris liked Paul Di'Anno's voice. He said there's a sort of quality in his voice, a raspiness or whatever you want to call it, that gave it this great edge. So clearly he wanted him. Di'Anno did the Soundhouse demo tapes that got them the attention that they needed. 2 really great albums. I think Killer is probably the best Iron Maiden album. I think probably a lot of people will disagree with me, but that's my favorite. And then, a really great concert album made in Japan.
Oh yeah, I love that album.
They did tours with Kiss, Judas Priest, UFO, so they were rising. And we can say, well, why get rid of Paul Di'Anno then? And there were a number of reasons. I mean, one of them was the fact that he was drunk and high all the time and was, kind of erratic in his performance. He would get into arguments on the Judas Priest tour. He was like talking crap to them, saying, we're better than you. And, the Judas Priest guys did not appreciate that. Di'Anno himself, when asked about this stuff, he said that Killers didn't have as much impact on him as the first album. It was moving away from what he felt to be the original kind of punkish stuff. Now, Steve Harris will say, we were never doing punk, they don't know what the hell they're doing, but Di'Anno certainly felt that. And Steve Harris clearly felt like Di'Anno's vocal performance was good for the time, but not what they needed. And then Di'Anno said this. So this is a sign of one of the things that would absolutely have to change, besides not getting high all the time. Di'Anno said about Harris and Smallwood, it's like having Mussolini and Adolf Hitler run your band. There can't be anyone else, and my character is too strong for that. So me and Steve was always fighting. Okay, so what if Paul Di'Anno had been more willing to take direction, didn't develop, a drug and drinking problem? Do you think Steve Harris would have kept him on? Because it really, I think, does come down to Steve Harris. What do you think, Scott?
Well, I might be going off on a limb here, but I think the drugs and alcohol gave him that mouth, he was probably high and drunk when he told the guys from Priest, I mean, as we know, a lot of not good stuff comes from being drunk. And it's interesting. I love Killers so much. I love the first album. And Steve Harris had said once, the first album, it was okay, but it was mixed horribly. And he goes, but the problem is so many fans tell me that's the best thing we ever did. So maybe I'm wrong.
Hmm.
There was a vibe to it, and I just wonder. We have to think the variables maybe had something to do with how he performed and sang, for better for worse, which would have eventually been not good. Like if he cleaned up, let's say, would it be the kind of same? Because like it carried off into the performance.
Yeah.
I love the Rainbow show, the Live at the Rainbow, right? And I wish we got another couple albums out of Di'Anno, because they're kind of separate bands to me, and I do
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
it's more punkish.
So maybe if we had a couple more albums, we would have better points of comparison, right?
Yeah, it is sad. It is, and he
I
still
mean,
goes.
let me ask you this. So I think that one of the concerns for Steve Harris was not just reliability and not getting the band into unnecessary conflict, but I think he envisioned Iron Maiden being a bigger band than they were. And I think, Bruce Dickinson was the kind of singer in two different ways that Steve Harris really wanted to have fronting the band. One was his voice. I mean, clearly Bruce Dickinson is a much more powerful singer with a greater range than Paul Di'Anno. I mean, I can't think of an area in which Paul Di'Anno can be said to be better than Bruce Dickinson, even like phrasing and stuff like that, you know. But
I would say different. I would say my first album was Live After Death for
okay.
Maiden, and I would say the early stuff was not the same without Di'Anno. It's like, Dickinson was singing it his way, which was very cool. But 22 Acacia Avenue, or what's the one,
Charlotte the Harlot.
Charlotte the Harlot.
Yeah.
And those early tunes, Di'Anno,
I think there's some early songs that Dickinson was able to make his own. Iron Maiden, Phantom of the Opera,
Phantom of the Opera,
Wrathchild. There are some where, in a way, Bruce Dickinson is overpowered. Sanctuary is better with Di'Anno than Dickinson, in part because Dickinson, as a better singer, does too much with the song. Which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but when I was listening to it, there was a couple others like that off the first two albums where you're like, yeah, I get what the song is, but it doesn't work quite as well with this clearly better singer than the guy who did it originally.
And I want to be cautious when I speak about that, because I think Di'Anno is a better punk singer than that's what I'm saying. Is I think Di'Anno is spectacular, and I think you could say Dickinson is better technically.
Oh yeah.
He's got a bigger range, but the phrasing and the attitude. I mean, I used to watch the Rainbow Live at the Rainbow so much, and I like how he introduced the songs. This is Remember Tomorrow,
Yeah.
And I remember one of my friends in school. What was the thing? Di'Anno had all the spikes on his arm.
Yeah.
One of my friends had that, and he was really so cool. I mean, at the time, we just had Circus Magazine and Hit Parade and all that, so we didn't know he was drunk and mouthing off at the time. We just know the record sounded great. And I'm kind of, I just think of them as two different bands. Of course, I'm a big Cliff Burton fan. I mean, Cliff, the drummer.
Oh, Clive Burr.
Clive Burr. Cliff
yeah.
Burton. Clive Burr, yeah. And I thought I always wished, the poor guy, he left because of health reasons.
Well, health reasons, also being drunk and high.
Also, yes.
And getting fired.
But
yeah.
I thought he was a far stronger drummer with a better rock
Nico
feel.
McBrain.
Yeah, Nico had a great personality. He was an ethos kind of welcome.
Yeah, and I think that Burr was jazzier. You can really, I mean, McBrain was great for the kind of stuff that they were doing on Peace of Mind, Power Slave. It made sense. But I can't picture McBrain coming up with the drum stuff on Gangland, you know.
No,
Um,
no, I just in his time, you know, if you listen to Live After Death, if you haven't listened to it in a while, the Nico's time is pretty bad on that album.
okay.
So he's, you know, I mean, he was just, you know, I don't have anything. I love him. You know, he's part of one of the greatest metal bands of all time. He's doing something right.
Yeah.
I don't want to put, Clive was much more consistent, was stronger with the feel, I thought.
Yeah. So Mark says, I prefer Di'Anno's vocals to Dickinson's in some of those early songs too. I quite enjoyed Di'Anno's post-Maiden work as well and feel he's quite underappreciated overall. I think things turned out better than if he had stayed with Maiden. And you know, so some of the follow-ups to this, right? We can ask like, well, what would have happened if Bruce Dickinson hadn't joined Iron Maiden? He would have probably stayed with Samson. Samson might have done quite a bit better than they did, because you listen to the albums after he leaves and they're just not as good. Bruce Dickinson was an integral part of that band. Di'Anno, I mean, some of the stuff that he brought out after he left was quite good, and he bounced around quite a bit. He wasn't able to like find a focus. I think one of the really interesting questions that we can ask about Paul Di'Anno, assuming that he does still get kicked out, because of the bitterness that he had, he wouldn't play Iron Maiden standards early on in his post-Maiden career. He's like, listen to the new stuff. And I think if he'd been more accommodating to his audiences and, done like, 5 Iron Maiden songs in his sets, which I think he would have had a perfect right to do, I think people would have, bought more albums, bought more tickets, more merch. He would have been doing a lot better than he did later on, both financially and psychologically.
Yeah, and eventually he did Paul Di'Anno's Iron Maiden, which
That's
was
right,
just
yeah.
Iron Maiden. I mean, early on, it's a tough call for me because as an artist, if I were to leave a big band like that, I would want to erase the slate and try to, like, at the time, we're looking back at it, but at the time, I think he's thinking, well, people know who I am and I have stuff musically to offer. So I don't entirely blame him for that. It just didn't really work out.
That's right. Yeah.
And if it did, it would have been great. But I know there's always this, and you always raise this good point about where's the balance between your artistry and the audience, and what do we owe the audience? You and I always ask as a philosophical question, like what is, or what's just self-absorbed. So, I kind of agree with you. If he did his stuff and then he came out and encored 4 Maiden tunes, that would have been like worth people would have heard,
or mix them in,
or mix them in.
I mean, there's a way to do that. You could be like, that I'm not with Iron Maiden anymore, but I was really part of this. We're going to do Running Free,
yeah,
something like that.
And you and I would have gone crazy.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about another one that's a what if that I think a lot of people don't know that much about. They know about how it turned out after the 1984 album, but they don't know that there was a possibility of this happening much earlier on. So, David Lee Roth is, he's not actually the original singer for Van Halen, but he's there pretty early on and in their formative years. And he definitely wanted to be part of the band. He provided them with the PA system, and he helps them out quite a bit. And they produce a 29-track Van Halen demo tape. Gene Simmons is an integral part of that. Kiss management doesn't see them as making any money, so they're like, nah, we're going to pass on this. And Van Halen's original producer, Ted Templeman, wanted to replace David Lee Roth with Sammy Hagar before Van Halen won. And the reason he did this, he talked about having anxieties, because David Lee Roth is a really great showman, but you talk about like being off on stuff. He misses notes. He's like kind of all over the map with stuff. And Sammy Hagar was a really well-established artist. He'd been in Montrose. He had a solo career. the original sound engineer on the album actually at one point was worried, and he said, we got to call Sammy Hagar in to do this album. So it was a live possibility. And interestingly, when they, however, there's different stories about how they parted ways. I think it's probably safe to say that he was fired. Eddie Van Halen, before he brought in Sammy Hagar, had two other people who he pitched becoming the lead singer to Van Halen for. Patti Smith of Scandal, and she declined. And then this is even weirder. Daryl Hall. Can you imagine Daryl Hall singing Atomic Punk or,
and especially after
Unchained or
and especially that's an especially weird one because it would have been different if we never heard of Daryl Hall and you bring him in.
Yeah.
But by that point, I Can't Go For That was out and Maneater was out. And, we had already knew the Hall & Oates routine.
Yeah.
If this was a sliding doors thing, I would like to pick that one and see how it would turn out. But those were real offers as far as I know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Daryl Hall declined. I forgot about the Patti Smith one.
Yeah. So there could have been some really weird timelines going on.
From Scandal, maybe that's a little odder, but that would have been pretty cool. I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
Well, it's like, we already have the What If with Gary Cherone and Van Halen 3.
That's right. Yeah. But so Sammy Hagar becomes a member, and on paper he looks better, right? He can play guitar, so now you've got a essentially 4-piece with 2 guitars, or he can play guitar while Eddie goes off and plays keyboards.
Yes.
So you can get a very different sound. He's also a singer who can reliably hit notes
and show up.
Yeah. But I don't know. What do you think about this, Scott? I would say that David Lee Roth has a sort of charisma that
yes.
Sammy Hagar has charisma. He does. It's sort of like comparing, my Subaru, which is a great car, with a sports car. The Subaru is very reliable and
yes.
get through the snow, but it is, and in some respects, it's going to handle better than some sports car, especially if it is snowing. But the sports car is going to blow the Subaru away.
Before I answer, I have a question for you because you iconically did something I didn't do. You saw the 5150 tour, correct?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so let me ask you. I remember we were the same age when you went to the show. Were you disappointed?
Not with that tour, but I also saw them 2 years later at Monsters of Rock. Or was it a year later?
OU812 probably.
Yeah, and what I didn't like was the fact that, and I think this is because of, it's probably because of the Van Halens were pissed off with Roth and they were like, yeah, enough of this bullshit. But also Sammy Hagar came in. They played Sammy Hagar songs like I Can't Drive 55.
Right.
They hardly played anything from the earlier David Lee Roth era. I think they played Panama, of course, but that was recent. They weren't playing a lot of the classics that you go to hear Van Halen. Instead, they did things like they did guitar solos where Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar are trading licks back and forth, and very showy. But I didn't feel like, I was a young kid, so I wasn't like, I'm not getting top value for my ticket or anything like that. But I don't know. I think that I missed the opportunity to see the real Van Halen, in a way.
And it's funny because here we have some answers to some what ifs. Like, picture if David Lee Roth continued with the band, but then we were here asking, well, what would the audience think if Sammy Hagar came on later? Well, we have the answer to that because it became the divided camp.
So here's the big question.
Yeah.
So what if Sammy Hagar was the replacement for David Lee Roth on that first album? Would Van Halen have taken off? I mean, David Lee
Oh,
Roth was involved in the songwriting. Now Hagar's a good songwriter too,
oh, he's a
but
great songwriter.
I don't know that you would have had his voice isn't, you know, I think that David Lee Roth in some respects is a more recognizable singer. I don't think that Sammy Hagar would have stuck out.
I think you're right. I mean, um, part of Roth's arrogance was enduring. Enduring. It's we liked it. Like it was kind of always he was always on, right? He was always kind of like on. The
Feels
first
like the
album,
drunk, screwed up uncle,
he is, yeah.
Uncle Good Time.
But I think Van Halen would have been huge because in LA
Because of
before
his
it took off.
playing.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, even Yngwie admitted he wanted to be Eddie Van Halen.
Okay.
Eventually, in his book, Yngwie's like, we all wanted to be Eddie Van Halen. He was the greatest. This is before they broke.
Okay.
So I think Eddie and his brother were headed for something great. Now, I wonder what songs we would have gotten. Like the riff to Atomic Punk was probably Eddie.
Yeah.
But I know that it comes out that him and Roth are basically the songwriters. And I don't know if I never heard the answer to, does that mean Roth wrote the lyrics and Eddie wrote?
Yeah.
They're all credited, so they all get the same in publishing.
Well, we know that Roth did write the lyrics because that was that was one of the other things that changed the mind of Ted Templeman. He saw, like, they had I don't know if it was a blackboard or a whiteboard or something, and Roth was doing this kind of stream of consciousness thing, and he's like, well, this guy, he's not a great singer, but holy crap, he's smart and he can put together ideas in a way that just kind of makes sense. And Atomic Punk is the song that he was talking about, seeing develop before his eyes. Yeah. I don't know that Sammy Hagar could do that. I don't know. I in some respects, I don't know enough about Sammy Hagar to say.
I mean, Montrose was,
I had VOA, and that was a decent album. A little disappointing, really. Montrose is good. He wrote the lyrics for that too.
And that one album with Neil Sean and Hammer. Did you ever have that one?
No.
It was Jan Hammer, Neil Sean, and Sammy Hagar. I think that was. They did some stuff together. Remember in the early 80s, there was like the super groups, like they had the one with Michael Schenker, and that was one of them. And a lot of those albums were good, but just kind of went out, no tour support, and they would just flop and end up in the cutout bin. You remember the cutout bin?
Well, and that was going back to Paul Di'Anno. He was in one of those super groups called Gog Magog, and they only came out with 3 songs. They weren't able to get along with each other. That's one of the big problems with super groups, is they have super egos,
Not only that, it doesn't. I always compare it to like Brazil has the greatest soccer players on the planet, but they don't win games because they don't work well together.
Yeah.
It's a team that wins a game,
Yeah, and so, I mean, going back to the Van Halen thing. So, I mean, later on, and it probably is an issue with the Van Halen brothers. I mean, when you see like David Lee Roth getting booted out, you could be like, well, okay, he was kind of a screw up. They didn't really like him at the start. It was sort of like Ozzy was not the, guy that they wanted in Black Sabbath, and they're like, well, we'll put up with this jackass because he seems to be doing good for us. But then, later on, they kick Sammy Hagar to the curb, and they also kick Michael Anthony to the curb for staying in touch with Sammy Hagar. So you're like, I don't know, maybe these guys really are hard to get along with. And you could say, well, Sammy Hagar was more professional. He meshed better with the band, but he only did so long as the Van Halen brothers felt so,
Yeah. I mean, that's complicated, the whole internal relationship. I think that's a great question about if they went with Sammy first, because it could have happened.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
I mean, there's probably maybe the whiteboard was the deciding factor. What if that didn't happen, and they bring in Sammy? I think it would have. I think it would have been huge. Still, I just think we would miss the Roth albums that we know happened, and if we could kind of picture those albums being erased and replaced by some other form of Van Halen, that then we would know that we would miss.
Yeah.
You know, and even, you know, I didn't think he was a terrible singer. He could carry a tune, you know, on those albums. You know, he could carry a tune for sure. I mean, Sammy's a stronger singer.
That's right. Yeah.
You know,
stronger but less distinctive, more kind of generic, you know. It's not that I don't like to listen to him, but I would much rather hear David Lee Roth's super distinctive voice.
Yeah. And his personality came out in his singing. You know, with his shouts and everything. I mean, I love it. I love it.
Yeah. You know, I mean, one of the people used to compare him to this other singer, Jim Dandy, from Black Oak, Arkansas, who I guess did similar stuff, running around the stage, just acting way over the top. And that was a turnoff for a lot of the music people. They were like, yeah, that's not very professional. It's just spectacle. But that's exactly what you needed to get your band noticed night after night after night, and get, you know, ordinary people. I mean, I think what the record executives like and what ordinary people like are often quite different.
Well, although back in the day, the labels were willing to put up with 4 flops or 5 flops.
Wow. Can you imagine that?
Now, these days, if you don't hit, well, I don't even know what's going on now, but
yeah,
early 2000s, if a band didn't hit gold within the first 2 weeks, they were dropped. You know, it's instant gratification in the business side. But I mean, Van Halen 1 was a huge success. So, but yeah, I mean, I think Zappa talked about that. Like, it was the old cigar chomping guys that were the best. And it's these young guys with ponytails and suits that don't give anything a chance, you know. But when the older guys were,
they're playing it safe, in other words. Yeah,
they're playing it safe. With the old guys, like, I don't know, put it out, you know.
So I think this is one where the what if really does massively change things. Maybe definitely more than the Toni Iommi one, probably more than the Paul Di'Anno one, you know. Let's talk about another LA one. So the big rivals to Van Halen in the 1970s were Quiet Riot, and things did not go well for Quiet Riot. At one time, the band breaks up because Randy Rhoads actually leaves. He's tired of their fighting back and forth. The original bassist tried to kill Kevin Dubrow. Kevin Dubrow was kind of a prickly fellow, and then they make it big. And the classic lineup that we think of nowadays as like Quiet Riot, Kevin Dubrow vocals, Rudy Sarzo bass, Frankie Banali on drums, and Carlos Cavazo on guitar. They have a #1 album in Mental Health, and they play the US festival. They become the biggest thing around, and it's, you know, they're on MTV. And, you know, Condition Critical wasn't as good of a seller, but it was still pretty.
It was a good album. Yeah.
Yeah. So where things went wrong, to the point that Sarzo actually quit the band because of this, was Dubrow would get on stage and then he would give interviews. And the one thing that he did that consistently that screwed them up, and he was doing it kind of out of bitterness. It was saying all these other LA bands suck. We're the real heavy metal people. We paved the way. And he was calling out Motley Crue, Rat, Wasp, some of the other bands at the time that were sort of second tier, and saying, if it wasn't for us, you guys wouldn't have the opportunities that you're having right now. And at the time, Quiet Riot was as big as Motley Crue and Rat, bigger than Wasp, certainly. Wasp is kind of coming in a bit later. And so what if he hadn't done that? What if he hadn't been driven by that whatever it was, bitterness, revenge, a feeling that other people were showing ingratitude. Would Quiet Riot have had the impact that, say, Rat and Motley Crue have had?
He
Maybe
burned a lot.
not as much as Van Halen had, but
Right. I mean, he burned a lot of bridges, but I do want to sidestep and bring in something interesting that I learned from you ethically, and that is
okay.
egoism. Now, this makes me think of a textbook case of egoism. It sounds like he's being egotistical, but in that school, he's not following the rules because he's doing something that's bad for him in the end, right? So
Yeah,
if
yeah.
I have that correctly, he's being egotistical. He's saying he's so wonderful, but it's actually in the end not good for him. And in egoism, it has to be good for the person. The
Well,
only
one can be a bad egoist, you know. You can have a moral theory and just apply it in a poor way. I think so. That's an interesting thing. I think that he was actually surprised in a way that the band wasn't. I think the band members were up there and they're like, "Oh man, Kevin is at it again. This is going to be bad for us." I think he was genuinely surprised when people were booing him while he was like talking crap about these other bands. And I think there's probably a couple reasons. One was it looks bad. It looks like you're, really arrogant, right? You're saying you're better than all these other people. And they were probably also fans of these other bands,
well, of
and they
course.
don't want to be put in the middle. I mean, none of us like to have somebody else saying, "You choose them or me," you know? So,
And this goes back to what we always talk about, who makes the jean jacket. And back in those days, everybody had a jean jacket with all these bands on the back. So, it's kind of
either
ironic.
that or you would write it on in pen.
That too. Yeah, they probably had the Sabbath, they probably had, or the Aussie, they probably had Rat. They had all the patches. I remember those days. And to get out live and to put down, I mean, it's a little contemptuous to the crowd because they're wearing their
Right,
favorite
right.
bands,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's kind of like, well, I love you guys, but Rat's my very favorite band. And if you're going to tell me Rat's, you're going to put down my very favorite band,
Yeah.
you got to go.
And factually, um, okay, so you could say that Quiet Riot doing so well did open doors for people in the metal genre and in particular for LA bands, but it wasn't just Van Halen and Quiet Riot bumping around in the 1970s. There was a version of Rat called Mickey Rat that was
Mhm.
already really active, playing in the clubs, putting out demos back in the mid 70s, late 70s. Um, I mean, there were bands that were precursors to Wasp and Motley Crue that Lawless and Six and people like that were playing in. Um, so yeah, Motley Crue wasn't around in the late 70s, but London was, and Circus Circus was. So
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about
yeah.
Circus.
So I don't know. I think that even factually, Dubrow didn't really have a good argument to make, you know.
Yeah, and a lot of their, although I feel like, to answer your question, I think maybe he didn't feel he got the respect that he thought he deserved. And
Yeah.
where it's like they're talking about all these amazing bands, or he'll see them written up really well, or they're selling out the Whiskey a Go-Go, and
Yeah.
that makes him angry.
I wonder too, and this is pure speculation, if the fact that he was not as physically attractive as the frontmen for these other bands, Warren
Right,
DeMartini,
right.
Vince
Vince Neil.
Neil, right? Even the guitarists, you look at I mean, actually, everybody in Quiet Riot looks better than Kevin Dubrow. He looks like a little troll, you know? I
Oh,
wonder
yeah.
if that had any, any
Well,
impact on.
but the Scorpions were huge. You look at Klaus
Oh,
Meehan.
that's true. Well,
Like,
the Scorpions as a whole all look like a bunch of rejects.
but I would say the success, with like Twisted Sister and Quiet Riot, they had perfect timing in the sense of this. The 80s, all the art was about the teenagers versus the oppressive parents that wanted to get rid of rock and roll.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so they had anthematic songs of rebellion.
Yeah, so imagine that Dubrow he does the opposite. Instead of like ill will, he's like, I love all these other LA bands. It's so amazing that we're part of this great scene.
Yeah.
Does Quiet Riot continue on and keep making great music instead of what they ended up doing, which is all these lineup changes and weird stuff that just didn't really work out? You think of a band like Rat, right? When we did our
Yes.
best album stuff, you can be like, well, Out of the Cellar is a massive album, but it was followed up by a lot of really great albums. And part of that is the fact that they kept a lineup. There's consistency. Actually Cavazo winds up being on one of the albums later on, but that's just because Robin Crosby dies, you
Yeah.
know. Whereas with Quiet Riot, things just kind of go downhill from Condition Critical onward. So put ourselves in a different timeline. What do you think, Scott? You're better equipped to assess this musically. Would they have been putting out consistent stuff? You still have Rudy Sarzo on bass, or would they have? Do you think they still would have declined?
I think so. The two albums that did really well for them, they were all together on the concept of this rebellion thing, which we
Okay.
loved when we were younger, right?
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and I think
They had the other games too, like Sax and Slick Black
oh, yeah.
Cadillac.
Yeah, right. I think what you're bringing up about the trash talking really probably isolated him from the band. It had to. I mean, I am kind of speculating, but I'm pretty sure if I was in that band, I would say, "Oh, he's doing it again. You can't do that," because my best friend is Warren
Yeah.
Martini, and now I got to see Warren for a drink tonight, and and so
Yeah.
if people, so now you've got people that aren't maybe as united on the theme. I mean, the riffs were cool, the albums were cool, but the message kind of died out after that. You can't, with so many lineup changes, is it just one person calling the shots rather than a group of people coming together on a concept? And I think they could have. I think anytime somebody's kind of out of control like that, they isolate other bands in the scene. They isolate their own band members from their friends, because remember, these people all hung out in LA at the
That's
Rainbow.
right. Yeah.
And to have your lead person trash talk these bands, I could only imagine if I was in that situation, I'd be extremely uncomfortable, because I'd have to talk about my bandmate and say, I don't agree with him. Like, I'm really sorry he said that, but now you're betraying your singer. I mean, it's just a recipe for, and then maybe he tried to call the shots and he wasn't the guy that was behind the whole thing after all, right?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to think about things like, okay, so Kevin Dubrow stays in the band. Who are we going to get to go on tour with? None of these LA bands are going to want to go on tour with us because we've trash talked them so much.
Or one of them gets big and you don't get to be on the opening slot in front of 20,000 people a night.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So your next album flops because nobody wants you to have tour support. And that's a
right.
big
Yeah.
thing. Opening bands, you've probably had the thing where you've seen an opening band, and before the main act got on stage, you wanted to go out and buy the record.
Yeah.
Because, we talk about that back in the day, them being young and hungry and coming out and giving you the best 30 or 45 minutes they can. And then your mind is blown and then you want to leave
You're
and
like,
go,
I want to hear more of these guys. Yeah.
yeah, I want to hear more of these guys. And
Yeah.
that was, and that was part of the reason. If a band wasn't huge, they would get the opportunity to go out and open for these major bands. You had a built-in crowd of 20,000-40,000 people. And if you proved yourself, you sold records.
Yeah.
And I think that hurt them a lot because you isolate yourself, and then Rat gets to be a headlining act, and then you're not invited because, I mean, you at very least, you ruin all these opportunities.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think
so. Let's shift gears back to British bands. We already brought this one up a little bit before. What if Brian Robertson, who only did one album and 1.5 tours with Motorhead, hadn't been such a weirdo and would have just like fit in, you know? So Motorhead's classic lineup, it gets shaken up in 1982 because Fast Eddie Clarke doesn't like the fact that the band records Stand By Your Man with Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics. He's like, this is not my Motorhead. I'm out of here. And so they're like, okay, what do? We need a new guitarist. And so they call up Brian Robertson, who is great in Thin Lizzy with Scott Gorham. And he agrees to complete the tour that they're on, the Iron Fist tour. And then he signs a 1-album contract with Motorhead for Another Perfect Day in 1983. And he said, I was just helping out some friends when they asked me to join officially. And this is a bad sign. He said, okay, but I'm not rewriting Ace of Spades. So this is the sticking point for Robertson. And then he also said in another interview, joining Motorhead was weird. Lemmy's manager, Doug Smith, phoned me up, and then he sent this girl around my place with a bottle of whiskey. Needless to say, the deal was struck. She gave me all the Motorhead albums, but I didn't listen to them because it's not my sort of music. So that tells you right there that's not a good fit. And then on the tour, he, everyone knows what Motorhead looks like. It's leather, it's tough guy stuff. Yeah. So this is the early 80s. He's wearing bicycle shorts and headbands and ballet shoes. And this is probably the worst one, leg warmers. You remember leg warmers from the 80s. Oh, yeah. That is not a way to look masculine at all. And the other thing was he refused on the Another Perfect Day tour to play Motorhead standards. And by the end of the tour, Motorhead was not filling up arenas. They had trouble getting even half of what they would normally draw. So he was killing them financially. And so they part ways. The fallout is that Motorhead is on hard times. Another Perfect Day doesn't do great as an album. And then soon after that, Phil Taylor's like, I've had it. I'm leaving. And Lemmy has to rebuild Motorhead. And so he does it by getting Pete Gill from Saxon to be drummer. And two guitarists, Phil Campbell, who'd been in Persian Risk, and the relatively unknown Wurzel. They get into trouble with their record company, Bronze Records, who don't want them to do a new album. They're like, you're unproven. You can't hold it together. You need to do a compilation album. And the most that they're able to do is sneak in Killed by Death in there. And they get into a court case, and that keeps them from being even able to record. So they go on tour and they try to have to rebuild everything. Now, what if Brian Robertson, instead of being a weirdo and being like, I'll do you this favor, but I'm not going to play any of your songs, and I'm going to dress like something antithetical to heavy metal. I don't even know if that would have flown in Thin Lizzy, for that matter, right?
Well,
warmers.
No.
Yeah, what was he up to? But now imagine a very different Brian Robertson, and then just listen to that album. There's not a bad song on that album.
I love that album.
I think it's one of their best. Yeah. And what would have been like in the 1980s if Another Perfect Day was 1983? Imagine, because Motorhead could put out an album every 1.5 or 2 years.
Wow.
So 1985, another album comes out, and it's not Orgasmatron. It's like Another Perfect Day, but other songs. 1987, 1989. And they're touring, they're making money, they're not having all these weird, shifts. And here's, I'll add one other little bit of detail, and then I'll let you go to town on this, Scott, because you're a guitarist, so you can say a lot about what would have happened with this. Eddie Clark said that Robertson was a really great player. He said, I think he played some of the greatest guitar for Thin Lizzy. And here's the part that I think is really relevant. He was a feel player, and I felt Scott Gorham was the more precise one. When Robbo left, I thought the band lost its identity. So Fast Eddie Clark, his style, is that kind of trippy, loose, groovy kind of stuff. I think Brian Robertson arguably did that just as well as Fast Eddie Clark. You listen to the solos, the riffs on Another Perfect Day, and you're like, man, this is really great stuff. But they didn't get much of a chance because of Robertson being a jerk, So what musical, let's start with like 3 more albums. What do you think that would have sounded like?
So I'm going to start off by saying when he's saying, I don't care about these Motorhead records.
Yeah.
I don't want to rewrite, any of the old stuff, but that is clearly a Motorhead album.
Oh yeah.
And so first of all, I don't understand the logic there. And I do agree the guitar sound, I mean, his tone is unreal. His parts are clever. He uses some like slight reverbs or slight slapbacks at some point to give it like a different effect. And his playing is so strong and the songs are so strong. But my first question would be, was he invited to be in the band, or was he a lot of times was he just paid as a side musician?
He was invited to come
Join?
in, finish the tour, and then they signed a contract with him for an album. And you get the idea that it was Robertson who said, one album I'll do with you. I think Lemmy really wanted him in the band.
So I wonder if he was first ever really in the band. Second of all, I don't see Lemmy ever having a problem going, you're not going on stage with that. I wonder if Lemmy allowed it and said, okay, I don't care. You do what you want to do.
Yeah.
And then how he could dictate no older stuff. I mean, the kind of power that Brian had kind of puzzles me, because I'm gonna wear what I want and I'm going to decide the set list. Was he that important to Lemmy?
It certainly seems so,
Yeah.
But imagine if he'd not had that insistence.
I would have loved it if more albums like that.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's not as if Orgasmatron isn't good. There's some cool songs on it. Deaf Forever, Dr. Rock. Trying to think of what else is particular. The Claw, that's a good one. But there's nothing where you're like, oh man, there's nothing like Overkill,
no,
Ace of Spades,
even the guitar tone on the follow-up album is, I would say, flat. If you A-B'd them, if you listen to the first track of the album, you would say, wow, Brian's tone is really, his tone is phenomenal, but like in the way he attacks. I mean, we always say in music, in guitar, tone is 70% your hands and 30% gear. 30% is a lot though.
Yeah.
Like, 30. So it's not like, but the way he attacked and played and the gear he chose, back then they were just Marshalls they all played. But I think, I mean, if we're saying if he wasn't such a jerk, or maybe so disagreeable, the way, because I play as a sideman and a session musician along with my music, and my philosophy is this: when a singer or a band asks me to come in, unless I'm joining the band, unless I'm an official member, if I'm asked, I'm basically there to deliver what they have in mind. It
Right.
tests the integrity of my musicianship. It's like,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, and I can admit, I go, hey, I can't be like Fast Eddie Clarke because I don't play like him. I play like me, but what do you want to do? You know, I'm happy to try to cop that stuff. I won't play the same as Fast Eddie, but let's put it in the set. I mean, that would be my role to go in rather than trying to take over the band, which is kind of a jerk move.
Yeah.
You know, that's an ego. That sounds like
I mean,
an ego
I
thing.
guess it seems like he knew he had them over a barrel, you know?
Yeah, but you know, I don't know. Maybe, you know, maybe that's why part of the luck that I work a lot is because I
You're
don't go.
accommodating, right? You're reasonable.
Well, you know, people are hiring you for a service,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and you know, and when it comes to, you know, I just did an album for a singer, and with the producer, I took directions and I offered solutions, but I never said I'm not doing that. You know, even some of the stuff I disagreed with,
Yeah.
I would deliver it until everybody had a smile on their face. So that sounds like, you know, we may have missed some really good albums because of a warped attitude
Yeah.
or like not knowing your place. Because I don't think he was. There's so many people you'd be surprised that aren't really in the band. Like Joel Hosker was never in Night Ranger. He was a hired gun even through that 10 years he was in the band. Everybody thought Joel Hosker was in Night Ranger. No, he was paid as a side musician. So and he did his job, and then Jeff Blades would give him, like, you could write a tune on the album, or you could, but he, you know, I know Joel, he's a sweet guy, and he could deliver. And so let's take that opportunity. If he joined, let's say he joined Whitesnake and tried to tell David Coverdale what was going to be in the set list, and you know, I mean, I just compare it to all that kind of stuff where it's like he's not a member. I think maybe it's not fair to call him a total jerk, but I think maybe we missed at least one good follow-up album because I really thought that was a great record.
Yeah. I mean, I would be willing to say that the sort of stuff that Fast Eddie and Brian Robertson do on guitar with Motorhead, Phil Campbell and Wurzel, who are good and have a lot of great songs with Motorhead, they just can't do.
Great. They're great. I'm not putting them down. I love them.
Yeah. They just don't have that kind of grooviness and space, and they're tighter in some respects, you know?
Yeah, I would say, like, when you listen to the Brian record, it's a rock and roll record right from the first tune. You're in it, you know. And this is
it's heavy, but it's also melodic, you know.
And you know, like we always say, because we always have this discussion, you know, everybody calls them heavy metal, but Lemmy's like, we're a rock and roll band.
Yeah,
you know. And I agree, it's a rock and roll band. And when I went and listened to that record again, I said, this is rock and roll. This is like, I don't think I would call it. I mean, it could be classified as metal or metal adjacent, but that's what I'm saying, is that's what even a sensitive layman would respond to, getting into the sound and everything. They may not be able to tell you specifically why they like it, but it is moving them.
Yeah.
So that's an important distinction, that, like, you know, you can trust a sensitive layman going, I feel that. Well, why? I don't know. It's just rock and roll. It just pumps me up, you know?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about another guitarist one. And I'm curious to get your take on this, particularly in terms of like technique. So Ronnie James Dio, the original guitarist for his solo project, was going to be J.K. Lee. And Lee had been in Mickey Rat, so the earliest iteration of Rat, did some recording stuff with them, and then he was in Rough Cut, which kind of never went anywhere. And by the way, another person who Dio will poach from Rough Cut is Claude Schnell, who he's playing those iconic keyboard parts on Rainbow in the Dark and Holy Diver. He doesn't actually get credited until the second album, but he's definitely part of the band. So Lee is going to leave Rough Cut in 1982, and then he'll be replaced by another important Dio guitarist, Craig Goldie. right? Who's going to take over after Vivian Campbell leaves. So Ronnie James Dio is putting together this band, sees Lee at a Rough Cut show, offers him the guitar post and hires him, and they even do some recording together and write some songs. And Lee's story is that Dio wanted him to play simple block chords that wouldn't get in the way of his vocals. He said that Ronnie was looking for more of a European kind of sound back then. Heavy metal had the American version and a European version, and the American version relied a lot on Van Halen. I'm more of that school. There was a bunch of us, maybe a little busier on my rhythm stuff than Dio would have liked, and I think that was the main reason. So, we all know what happens with J.K. Lee. He goes on to be the replacement for Randy Rhoads and Ozzy's band. He beats out George Lynch, who's up for contention. And then, like just about everybody who worked with Ozzy, Sharon Osbourne screws him around. He doesn't get songwriting credits like he should. And
or the money.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And eventually gets fired over the phone. Big surprise to him, but typical sort of Sharon Osbourne kind of stuff. And Dio instead is going to go with Vivian Campbell, who's quite young at the time. And Campbell said, Ronnie gave me great advice about building a guitar solo with memorable lines and not overplaying. I appreciated that guidance. If left to my own devices, it would have been a case of how many notes I could fit in. And he said, but he also, there were some tensions because I was so much younger than Ronnie. I'd look at Rat, Van Halen, and Doc and think that they were having a lot more fun than we were. They didn't take themselves as seriously as Ronnie did. And so, Campbell is only going to last several albums before he's on his way out. And Dio fires him, and Vinny Appice has talked about that and said that was a terrible idea to do at the time, but that's what happened. So if you think about Bark at the Moon, right? You look at what J.K. Lee is doing throughout that entire song. So again, early Ozzy period, you can understand this idea about the busyness of his playing. That's part of what makes it such a great song. And hard enough to play that J.K. Lee does videos where he's like, a lot of people play it this way. That's wrong. Here's what's actually going on in the song. And, you think about Vivian Campbell's stuff on those first two major albums that just cemented Dio's place. It is, it's massive chords. It's great solos. There's not the kind of flourishes that Lee has mixed into his stuff. So here's like the first question. Well, what if Dio had been cooler with that? Would that have screwed up the sound?
Yeah. Oh, it would have changed it significantly. Absolutely. Putting those two players together. I mean, Vivian, as far as here's the important part about the build your solos. Like I always liked when I was younger when Vivian would hold on to that one note and let it kind of sing out there with a little vibrato. You have to be an exceptional player to sell that kind of space and that kind of, because if you're playing really fast, you don't have to worry about like a little clam here or there or finger tone.
Yeah.
So if you like say the last in line solo where he does those three long held notes, he's got the perfect vibrato. He strikes the note just perfect. So if J.K. Lee listened and did that kind of thing with the solo, the feel would have been different. Vivian's time's a little looser.
Okay.
Than J.K. Lee's. I'm not saying it's better because I'm a big J.K. Lee fan. He's amazing. But I think Vivian was the perfect member for that band. And his sound and just his looseness of everything. And I remember thinking, well, it's even what Zakk Wylde said on the first Ozzy album. They kept saying, I don't want people to think I suck, because that was a time where every guitarist was shredding through their solo. And Vivian on some of his solos wouldn't have an impressive lick, but it would be the most memorable solo. And then it became that everybody wanted to learn the Vivian solos, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and now he's kind of like, he's older now, but he'll talk about it. Like he'll show up to the Dio shows and like, you know, and he'll play his classic solos. And maybe it's his age, but he plays them just like they were because he actually realizes the intrinsic value.
What do you think about the riffing too? I mean, I mean, it's also playing with Jimmy Bain on bass, right?
Right.
Instead of it being like this, you know, straight, there's a lot of like pauses, short little pauses in Dio music, but it all fits perfectly, and you're only pausing for like a microsecond. Last in Line is a great example, you know,
Right.
da, 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 da. There's that like break in there. Lee probably would want to fill that in with something.
Well, take Sacred Heart.
Okay.
Now it's pretty straight. Boom, ba-da, ba-da, ba, 3, 4, ba-da. And I used to listen to that a lot because it gave me this, it was very dark the way the guitar just kind of like sustained, and it was the least busy, right?
Yeah.
And I remember listening to that, thinking the riff with the bass going boom, 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 boom. And I thought rhythmically it was like so perfect. And it gave me this real dark feeling of like, you know, and I think the space and the patience, you know, at the time, I just thought, what a patient player, like for such a young kid, how mature his playing was. And to his credit, he was listening to Dio, who really knew, you know, he knows what he was talking about. He had a vision. And I think Jakey Lee at the time, maybe he was caught up in, I don't want people to think I suck. I want to have that shred solo. I want to have that, the part that's really hard to play. I don't know, Jake, but you know, it seems like,
well, I mean, we can look at the stuff he did with Ozzy and on those 2 albums, and you know, the riffing is great, but it's complex. Now 2 different bassists. He got to play with Bob Daisley. And you know, then he's playing with Phil Susan on The Ultimate Sin, and apparently they didn't really get along that well. And that's not a good thing to happen. The disconnect between the bassist and the guitarist, especially in a 4-piece, you know.
Well, if you listen to Shot in the Dark, the riff is supposed to be simple. But like how much he decorates, he doesn't leave any space.
Yeah.
So he's always doing some kind of riff in between them or pinch harmonic.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's not a defect. I mean, I had much of my career I was afraid to leave space.
Okay.
So leaving space is hard, and I just think, I mean, it sounded amazing. I love Jake's playing. The Ultimate Sin.
It's interesting. I'll say something about public speaking and presenting things in terms of philosophy. I am more of a J.K. Lee than Vivian Campbell that way too, in that I don't usually like pause and just let the audience think about stuff. I'm pretty continuously talking, you know. So I can relate to that. And maybe at the beginning it was a fear of like, oh, I can't have blank space. But now it's become a habit.
And I go through my students a lot where I'll say, we'll play something. I'll go, I want you to improvise. And they can't leave a space, but then if they land on a note, they have this nervous vibrato where they shake the note really fast. Right. Yeah. And vibrato is something you develop, you know, it's a very personal thing. And so I said, okay, this time I want you to leave 6 beats or a measure and a half empty. Yeah. And I said, and you're not allowed to use any vibrato. So if you land on a note, it has to be pure.
Okay.
And it's surprising how many people have a really hard time with that. And, you know, and I go, what's the matter? And they're like, I don't know. And I go, does it make you uncomfortable? And they say, yes. And
interesting.
I said, I get it because I listening to me when I was younger, the fast vibrato, the I'm leaving space here, or I'm holding this note before the next phrase, but I have to make it exciting somehow. So I'm gonna, and so with speaking, for me, it's the same way. I'm better at leaving space when I play guitar than I am speaking, but I'm always afraid I'm going to lose my train of thought, or I think I'm going to,
Yeah.
quick get it out while you're thinking about it. But
Here's another follow-up with this. So let's say Dio does have J.K. Lee and it doesn't quite work out, but Ozzy has George Lynch as the replacement for Randy Rhoads instead of J.K. Lee. I mean, what do you think that would have sounded like?
so, like we wouldn't, well, first of all, we wouldn't have Killer of Giants. We
Right.
wouldn't have all that stuff. It would have been really different. Although the thing I really like about George Lynch is his playing was very greasy and very swaggery. Like when he played, his feel was, I would put his feel more towards how Eddie Van Halen's feel was, or Randy Rhoads,
Okay.
or it would be that. But I don't think we wouldn't have gotten Bark at the Moon, which I mean was pretty much the best song in my opinion on that album. But Ultimate Sin, I like most of that album.
Yeah.
And J.K. Lee or is, I'm sorry, but at the time when Ultimate Sin came out, we all loved Jake because we thought Killer Giants was so cool. I would say Jake was a good choice because he's a fantastic guitar player. He's obviously a very creative player, where George Lynch, I love George Lynch, but he's a different kind of creative. So we would have heard something pretty different. And especially that, they relied on the guitarist to write so much. I mean, Randy Rhoads wrote Diary of a Madman and Crazy.
Yeah.
And all of those epic riffs and stuff, they come from the guitarists that end up getting ripped off. So it would have been up to whatever George Lynch came up with.
Yeah. Well, and apparently going back to the Quiet Riot thing, some of those riffs were from early Quiet Riot material that Rhoads brought with him. So I think we probably have time for considering one more.
Okay.
So we did talk a bit about Cliff Burton already, so let's not do that one. Let's talk about another Metallica one. What if Dave Mustaine was able to stay in Metallica? So he actually says that he doesn't think Metallica could have survived if he stayed in the band. And he said, the crash in Wyoming where he was driving them, that's what made me the guy that had to go. And I probably was destined to leave before that. There was so much personality between the four of us. I don't know that we could have survived. There was destined to be some kind of explosion at some point. So that's Mustaine's take. But let's say that wasn't the case. So Metallica is this really catalytic band. I mean, Mustaine leaves and founds Megadeth, motivated by anger. He said, I wanted to be faster and better, and my songs are going to be heavier. So it's kind of promoting something. On the other hand, Metallica sucks in talent from other bands. Kirk Hammett came from Exodus. Cliff Burton came from Trauma. Flotsam and Jetsam gave Jason Newsted, right? So in a way, Metallica is taking away talent from other people. Right. And why does Mustaine get fired? I kind of like Diano, fired because of drug and alcohol problems. He clashes with bandmates. He's overly aggressive with people, and he gets replaced by Hammett, so he doesn't get to record on Kill 'Em All, although he gets 4 song credits on there. He's clearly an incredible guitarist and composer and band leader. So, imagine that talent had stayed in Metallica. I mean, I don't think you would have seen the Black Album,
No.
With Mustaine there. He probably would have, this is poser crap, or something like that. So, I think this is a really interesting one to consider. And I also kind of think that the bassist guitarist connection is also important here. I mean, he got to play with Cliff Burton, and then, Megadeth is what it is in great part because of Mustaine, but I don't think without David Ellefson, you have Megadeth. I mean, his jazzy bass playing. So you got these two just massively great, important bassists who contribute to the songwriting process, that are there, and both of them are kind of stabilizing influences for this crazy guy. So let's assume that he could have gotten along with Hetfield and Ulrich. What would Metallica have sounded like without Kirk Hammett, with Mustaine doing the solos instead and writing more songs? Like, I mean, one of the songs is so good that it's a Metallica and a Megadeth song, Mechanics / the Four Horsemen, or Jump in the Fire, Metal Militia. I mean, those are some massive songs.
I would say, first of all, Mustaine is a born leader. I don't think it would be so much a democracy. However, I mean, you just hear the stuff that he wrote with Megadeth. I mean, there would have been more hard rock hits. There would have been more metal hits rather than the Black Album hits.
Yeah.
Because look, let's face it, Megadeth, Symphony of Destruction, that's a metal tune that was radio friendly too.
I think there's more continuity though, from early Megadeth, Killing Is My Business, Peace Sells, through the 90s. It's not like with Metallica, you're like, holy crap, they're going this way now, now they're going this way, right? It's very disjointed. I don't see anything like that with
no. And the question about Kirk Hammett, I mean, he seems like such a nice guy. His playing worked early on. Kirk's playing worked early on because it was aggressive 18-year-old testosterone. But the fact that I just feel like his solos are directionless. Like one of my favorite solos is Nothing Else Matters, which he didn't play. Hetfield played that solo, and that had you could sing that solo, but I would have, the solos would be much more interesting, just in my opinion. I mean, people may disagree with me with Dave Mustaine, because Dave could play a lot of notes, but he has his way of phrasing and presenting things. I just think I like his fire better than Kirk Hammett's. When he presents, and you got another singer in the band.
True, yeah.
There might have been harmonies. There might have been, like he get his 2 songs per record or something. They might have had. It would have been. I mean, I would hazard to say I would probably enjoy it much more if Mustaine. But he's a born leader. I could see him just butting heads.
Yeah,
and not getting along. But if he were, that would, he would become kind of the leader of Metallica, which would have been kind of cool.
Yeah, it would have definitely have changed the dynamic. Kurt Hammett has said that ever since he was brought into the band, it was very clear that Ulrich and Hetfield were running the show,
right.
Which I don't think is completely correct. I mean, Burton was so massively important that
right.
Maybe, Burton just had the personality to be like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, guys. I mean, and you talk about solos, Call of Cthulhu, some of the stuff that you think is guitar solos is actually Cliff Burton on bass, or those early licks in For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's Cliff Burton on his distorted bass,
Yeah.
So, that's pretty crazy. So, I mean, these 4 guys together, I mean, the weakest link there is Lars Ulrich then, right?
Oh yeah, I would agree. I mean, I feel bad for the guy because we all picked on Lars for like the Napster thing, and then I think we should all be wearing shirts saying Lars was right.
Well, that's a very interesting topic, and I think you're right about that. They took a lot of heat for that, but maybe they were prescient about where things were going, or they had the right take for the wrong reasons. They're like, you're not going to
Right.
rip us off, man. You know, and all of us were like, you guys are making so much money. What are you
Right.
complaining about? Right.
But he's a good drummer. I wouldn't say he's like, I mean, he's perfect for Metallica. Like I say, he's doing something right because they're one of the most known and loved metal bands. You know, if you
Yeah.
full of anybody that they don't like metal, but they like Metallica.
I mean, I think that he was incredibly important as a catalyst because he not only knew so much speed metal, new wave of British heavy metal that he was into and steering people towards.
Well, that's true.
He was the connector. He was bringing people together. I mean, he's the one who, you know, like connected them with Motorhead because he was the head of the Motorhead fan club chapter in the area, right? And I think stuff
Cool.
like that. Okay, so you don't have to be a great musician to be able to do that, but that sort of stuff, that goodwill building, that's pretty important, you know.
And that goes back to the Dubrow thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But
All
yeah,
right. Well, I think we've explored, there's a lot more that we could explore, but we've been going now for about 2 hours. So maybe we should bring it
yeah.
to a close here. Scott, do you want to have any last words on what ifs? I mean, I'll ask you this: is there any what if that like you really would have liked to have brought up that we didn't get to?
I mean, we always have the question: what if Randy Rhoads and that pilot weren't screwing around?
Yeah.
And then everybody speculates that he would have just gone into full classical mode. I don't know about that. There was probably more Aussie records. And maybe he would do something on the side, but I would be curious because Randy died so young that what if the pilot wasn't messing around and being an idiot? I mean, what are the chances of that? And and it happened. So
yeah. And continuity then in Osborne's band
and where he would have gone. Who he might have joined next, or maybe he would start his own project, what he would sound like in the late 80s,
Yeah.
But that's the only one that I always kind of think about is well, like Jimi Hendrix, what was next? Some of these people that were innovators or fantastic and they're just starting their thing, But that's my only one. I mean, I could go on for days, but that's
all right. Well, that's a good place to end it. Mark has a good one here. Mine would have been a what if of the Scorpions with Michael Schenker and Uli John Roth. Talk about somebody who's influenced by Hendrix too,
Oh God, yeah.
On Roth. He's like, that's what I'm doing, man,
Oh wow, that's sick. That's a thought.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's bring it to a close. Thanks to everybody for watching and participating.
Yeah.
And we've got some other great stuff lined up for the year ahead. And Scott, thanks for being here. Mark, thanks for your contributions.
Thank you.
All right. I'll see you later.
Take care.